helping people cope with and overcome life's challenges. This is Life Transformations with Michael Hart, certified Christian counselor and director of Ottawa's Elim Counseling Services.
Hi, I'm Michael Hart, director of Elim Counseling Service, a Christian counseling ministry in Ottawa. And I want to thank you for listening to this edition of Life Transformation, a Christian radio show where chains are broken and lives are transformed. If you're not familiar with Elim Counseling Ministry, you can find out more about us on our website at elimcounselingministry.com. When you go to the website, there is also a follow us tag where you can follow us on Facebook and also on Twitter. A little bit more about Elim. We're a counseling ministry, and as such, we try to provide counseling for everyone, but we are trying to reach out to those who may need counseling and may not be able to afford it. So there are times when we see people who cannot afford to go in rates of counseling at $160 per hour. They might be able to afford $5, or as recently as this week, someone was able to afford nothing. And we are able to see those clients based on donations to the ministry. So if you haven't donated to us in the past, please consider making a donation to be helpful for us to meet the needs of those. And thank you again for joining us and listening to this edition of the Life Transformation radio show. We have another interesting show lined up for you, interesting and helpful, because we believe this topic is a topic that many of us are confronted or have confronted or know someone who is confronting. And I'm talking about mental illnesses. The title of today's show is When a Family Member Has a Mental Illness. When a family member has a mental illness. And to help me go through discussing this show today is Melissa Waggott. Welcome, Melissa, and it's good having you in studio with me today.
Good to see you, Michael. So we've talked about different types of conditions in the past on our show. And with mental illness, there's a broad range of conditions that are out there. So before we begin to get too deep into today's content, I was wondering if you could clarify for the listeners what type of conditions specifically we'll be exploring today.
Absolutely. It's a very good question. As you said, there's a whole book of maybe over 500 pages.
It's very thick. I've seen it.
The DSM-5 it is now that outlines many different categories of mental illnesses. So it's quite a broad category. So let me say that in this show, when we talk about mental illnesses, we're talking about illnesses such as schizophrenia and affective disorders, which include bipolar, major depressive disorder, and anxiety disorder. So we're not talking about someone just having a mild depression, for example. We're talking about very debilitating mental illnesses here, such as the categories that I have just outlined.
So when you discuss mental illness, are there examples of mental illness that can be seen in the Bible?
I think one of the situation that comes to mind is the story of Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 4, verse 33, where it says that Nebuchadnezzar developed a condition where he started behaving like an ox or like a cow, and that he went out in the field on all fours, and he began to grow hairs like feathers of an eagle, and his nails became like those of an animal. And it's interesting because the condition that Nebuchadnezzar has been found in current day psychological literature, and it has actually been given a name. It has been given the name boanthropy, and it's a mental disorder in which a person believes himself to be an ox or a cow. So it's a mental condition, and I think it might be some branch of schizophrenia where a person has bizarre behavior and delusional behavior. So Nebuchadnezzar actually had the delusion for a period of time, I think it was 7 years, where he actually went out in the field and behaved as if he was an animal.
So with mental illness, there's often many misconceptions associated with it. Can you address some of those misconceptions that are out there about mental illness and the people that suffer from it?
That's a very, 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 very appropriate way for us to go about this show, because I think there are so many dangerous, I think, misconceptions out there about mental illnesses that it's very important for us to address those at the very beginning. And I think the media has done a lot of damage by giving certain perceptions of people who are mentally ill. And I think one of the most damaging perception of mentally ill people is that they're violent and dangerous. So, for example, people with schizophrenia, there are people who have withdrawn from friends who are suffering from schizophrenia, refuse to be around them, or refuse to let them be even near their children with whom they were very good friends before, because they have a perception that the person who is schizophrenic is likely to harm violently their children. And I think this kind of misconception has a large part to do with shows such as Psycho. There's a whole series, I think, of Psycho Part 1, 2, and 3, if I'm not mistaken, where a mentally ill person is portrayed as this very violent murderer that, savagely kills people with a knife. And so this misconception that people with schizophrenia or bipolar is somehow dangerous is a very, very, very wrong perception of mentally ill. Some of the most loving and caring and gentle people that I meet are some of my clients with schizophrenia. They are not violent at all, and I am by no means afraid of being in my counseling office alone with them. This is not to say that there are not schizophrenic people who are violent, but I think there are, just as there are people in the general population who are violent, there are people with schizophrenia or violent, but it doesn't mean that if you have schizophrenia, you suddenly turn into a mass murderer.
One does not equal the other.
One does not equal the other, and I think that's one of the dangerous misconceptions. I think another misconception is that mental illness is very uncommon, and I think it's not as rare as people think. We are told that 20% of Canadians will personally experience a mental illness in their lifetime, and this may be referring to other classes apart from what we are dealing with in this show. But it's interesting to know that about 1% of Canadians will experience bipolar disorder, and about 1% of Canadian suffers or will suffer from schizophrenia. So, in those categories that we are dealing with in this show, we see that it's not uncommon. I think bipolar and schizophrenia, maybe about 2%, 2 out of every 100 people will be struggling with that illness.
And we can move forward to say those people, that 2%, have families
right.
and friends are being affected by this too, which hopefully through today's show we can give a little bit of advice and help to them for that.
Absolutely. And I'd like to give a little bit of hope to families out there who might be listening to this show today, who are having a family member who is suffering from one of these conditions. Maybe your family member has just been diagnosed with schizophrenia or bipolar. I'd like to say that there is hope, because there are many people who are or functioning very highly and very effectively in society today who were diagnosed in the past with these conditions, and they're a productive member of society because they have received treatment and they are dealing much better with the condition, but through the medication and the help that they have had through counseling.
I think one of the other misconceptions that I've heard thrown around a little bit too, that just for the show to clarify, is that Christians can't suffer from mental illness or don't suffer from mental illness.
That's a very dangerous one, I think. Yes.
And I think from our discussions offline as well, Michael, we've discussed that Christians, like anyone, can suffer from these conditions.
Right.
And it's not a reflection of their lack of faith or lack of spirituality or doing bad things.
Right.
It's an illness like any other that anyone can be affected by.
Absolutely. So if we look at very stalwart biblical characters such as Elijah, for example, we think that Elijah had a case of depression, very chronic depression, where he actually laid down and wanted to die. He said, God, take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors. And he was in a very negative and hopeless state. And I don't think there's anyone here who knows their Bible who would look at Elijah and said Elijah lacked faith. However, what we see in today's society are people who cast judgment on people who are suffering from depression today, or who has a mental illness, and say it is because of your lack of faith, or who will tell these people who are in the midst of their suffering, just believe in God and just have faith, and you wouldn't be thinking the negative ways that you're thinking. Now, if it was that simple, then they would choose not to be in that condition. But the fact that people just can't snap out of it is proof that it's a lot more than just a lack of faith.
Mm-hmm. So, as we were talking about earlier, this show's really targeted at family members with someone a loved one who's experiencing mental illness. What are some common reactions when someone in the family has a mental illness?
That's a very good question. The reactions, I'll come to in a moment. Just like to mention one other thing before we go on to that, is to say that another dangerous misconception is that people with mental illnesses are possessed by the devil.
And
we see that a lot with illnesses such as schizophrenia, where a person, because they have a biblical worldview and understanding of the Bible, they will hear voices speaking to them, and these people say, the devil is speaking to me. The devil is telling me these things. Now, they're interpreting the voices as the devil because they're familiar with the biblical view of the demonic and so forth. And unfortunately, we see a lot of cases where these people who are mentally ill, or people are performing exorcism on them, and people are telling them to rebuke the devil, and they are being made to feel as if they are somehow evil and is connected with evil, and it has nothing to do with their spiritual state. They're suffering from a chemical imbalance. They're mentally ill. Now, let me just say here that I'm not saying that demon possession doesn't exist, because I've seen with and dealt with people who are demon possessed, and I've been involved in helping people in exorcism and so forth. But it's not as common that we think, where everyone that hears voices has a demon. There are times when a person who is hearing voices is having a mental illness and needs to be treated for that mental illness. So there needs to be discernment in these cases. And I think one of the first things that I do when someone walks in my office who is hearing voices is that I do what is known as a spiritual inventory, to see whether or not there are anything in this person's life that may have opened them up to the demonic.
And so what would that inventory look like? Or what would be included in that inventory?
Their spiritual beliefs, what kind of religious practices are they partaking of? Have they been involved with occultic practices such as exposure to the Ouija board? Have they been involved in seances and so forth? So have they taken any kind of oath where they have committed themselves to the devil? And these kind of explorations, sometimes you'll be surprised. A lot of times the answer will be no, but occasionally you meet people who are hearing voices, and when you go through that list, you say to yourself, this is a spiritual thing. There is probably demonic influences or demonic possession here. But in most of the cases that I see, when we do the inventory, people are Bible-loving Christians who have never been exposed to any of this kind of evil. And so in those cases, we would rule out the possibility of being possessed.
It's really important that you clarify that, because I think sometimes as Christians, we have the propensity to over-spiritualize many things, well-intentioned, but it's important, as you say, to have that discernment.
Absolutely. And in case you're just joining us, you're listening to the Life Transformation Radio Show, and I'm your host, Michael Hart, and with me in studio today is Melissa Wagat, and we are discussing the topic today, mental illness. When your family member has a mental illness, and we've looked at common misconceptions. Three of the misconceptions that we talked about is that the first misconception is that a person with mental illness is violent. The second is that mental illness is very uncommon, and then the third is that if you have a mental illness, you're possessed or being oppressed by the devil. And I think you had another question that we didn't get to.
Yeah, just where we're speaking about families. I was just wondering if you could explain a little bit about some of the common reactions that are seen in families when they find out someone has a mental illness.
Well, I think one of the first reaction is denial. Because it's as if this could not be happening to our family. This could not be happening to my loved one. And so a lot of people will see symptoms or sign that a person is mentally ill for years and will do nothing about it because there is almost this denial and this refusal to look at the situation. And then over time, the condition gets progressively worse until a person has to be hospitalized or admitted. And it's then often that the reality hits that, yes, this person has a mental illness, and then they are diagnosed with a mental illness. But I see in Christians a lot of time, even after the loved one is admitted and diagnosed, there is still this denial where they refuse to believe that their child could be schizophrenic, and they will still view it in the spiritual context, preferring to say that the person is being oppressed by the devil. And sadly enough, in some cases, refuse even medication because they're choosing to look at it from a Christian worldview instead of the medical viewpoint. And I'm not saying that there is not some cases, as I said before, that are spiritual, but in a lot of cases, the person who is showing these signs of hearing voices or seeing things, it's a mental condition that needs medical treatment. So denial, I think sometimes families suffer from shame, where if someone hears that, oh, my child has schizophrenia, or my child is bipolar, or that I am suffering from schizophrenia, I might be judged. So there is a lot of shame. Sometimes there is guilt. What have I done wrong as a parent that has caused my loved one to be afflicted with this condition? And Christians sometimes carry a lot of guilt because they feel, maybe if I had prayed more, maybe if we had more Bible studies, in-home Bible studies, or maybe if we didn't fight so much, then our child would not be afflicted with this condition. So those are the common reactions. But in terms of guilt, let me say that even if you were the best parent in the world who read your Bible 24/7 at home, if it's a medical condition, it would still happen regardless of the spiritual disciplines that you have in your home.
It's an illness like any other.
It's an illness like any other illness.
And I can see how, having heard you explain the misconceptions around these types of mental illness, how families can go through this denial and this shame and this guilt. Because though I think our perception of mental illness is improving and we're understanding it more as a disease, there's still those labels that are out there that aren't necessarily very positive. So the other thing that comes up is about medications and treating medical illness. What are some of the factors that make it difficult for some people to seek medical help when they find out someone has mental illness? And then the second part of my question is, what makes it difficult for someone to actually take medication to treat their mental illness? Okay,
so one of the first problem where people sometimes refuse to take medication is the spiritualization of the condition, especially in Christian circles, where a person feels, if I give in to medication, if I take medication, it is somehow a lack of faith, and therefore I cannot bring myself to take medication. And a second part to that is, sometimes if a person gives in to taking medication, it's like an admittance. The denial is broken. Like it's a proof that I really have this condition and I'm mentally ill. So people refuse that reality and remain in the denial mode because they feel that if I am not taking medication, it means that I am normal, where in fact that they do need help. And unfortunately, there's this kind of stigma related to mental illness, where some of my clients who I'm seeing who are not yet on medication or refusing to take medication will say things like, if I take medication, it means that I am crazy. And this is the kind of mindset where you have to help them to see that having a mental illness doesn't mean you're crazy. It's an illness just like any other illness that could come on anyone.
And if you had a headache, you would take a Tylenol.
You will take a Tylenol, or you'd wear a prescription glasses if you can see.
So if someone does choose to start on medication and has been consulting with the appropriate professionals to get on that regime, what are some of the things families should keep in mind once their loved one starts taking this medication?
Well, I think the first thing that you should bear in mind is that medication is, as contrary to what we think, it's not an exact science. Sometimes we feel that the doctors, they have so much knowledge that you're going to go in and they're going to give you a pill and it's going to fix everything, and you're going to just continue on your merry way and life will continue as before you had the condition. But the reality is that for many people suffering from mental illness, they'll realize that they will go in, they will be prescribed one medication, and for whatever reason, because it's not an exact science, what worked for someone else doesn't work for that person. And then in a few months, the doctors will have to prescribe a second medication and sometimes a third and a fourth and a fifth medication before they can find the right kind of medication and the right dosage of medication for that person. So in a lot of ways, it's a trial and error that a person has to go through before they find what actually works for them. The sad thing is that a lot of people will go in, they'll be prescribed one thing, and then they will say, medication doesn't work. It doesn't work for me. And they will come off their medication, and then they will have a lifetime of suffering and a lifetime of, suffering from the symptoms of the disorder. Whereas if they had this kind of knowledge that I'm giving here today to say it takes time. Doctors they don't work magic, and they have to do a lot of trial and error to find what actually works for you in your condition that you're in. And I think the second thing that we should bear in mind where medication is concerned is that it takes 3 to 6 weeks for medication to begin to have effect. So if you go in and you start taking a medication, it doesn't mean that in a week or even 2 weeks the medication is going to make you feel better. As a matter of fact, you can expect to feel worse in some cases because your body is adjusting to the new medication, and it takes a period of 3 to 6 weeks before your body actually adjusts and you start feeling normal again, and normal in the sense of the side effects or that you're having in the beginning goes away, and you start reaping the benefit of the medication. And I think another thing that clients should know, if you have a family member suffering from mental illness or you yourself, it's that if you are taking any medication and you start having severe or debilitating side effects, you should go back to the doctors immediately, even if the doctor says come back in 6 weeks. And I'm not talking about minor discomfort here, like you have a little nauseous feeling and so forth, or minor headache. If it's severe, then you should go back to the doctor to say this is having this kind of adverse reaction on me.
So as a family member, seeing that, they could encourage them to go in.
Absolutely.
So to wrap it up here, if someone is listening and they may be sensing that their family member may be suffering from some of these types of mental illnesses that we've talked about,
right,
what would you suggest that they do?
Well, first of all, I would suggest that if a family member is suffering from from a mental illness, it's important to not to take any kind of blame on yourself. Not to start feeling as if you have somehow contributed to that mental illness, because the studies that have been done on mental illness shows that mental illness covers a wide range of the population, people of the different demographics, people of different age group, different religious faith, different cultures, and different spiritual beliefs, and it doesn't affect person for any particular reason. It can come upon anyone in the same way that anyone can contract a cold. So in terms of feelings of guilt and guilt, you should absolve yourself of any responsibility for your loved one suffering from mental illness. Also, where shame is concerned, one of the reason for having this radio broadcast is that I want to bring about a greater awareness to mental health issues, to let people know that mental illness, it's just like any other illness, and there's nothing to be ashamed of. It doesn't mean that you have failed or there is something there's something that your family has to hide because you have mental illness. It can happen to anyone. And as I said before, some of the most stalwart biblical characters, such as Elijah, we talk about David, had conditions that could be diagnosed as mental illness.
And so I guess I think what we're really hoping through this show is to give hope to our listeners that if you are experiencing things, there's help out there. And the important thing is to seek that help and to not take it all upon yourself as being something that you did or didn't do.
Absolutely.
And most importantly, love your family member because they're still your family member.
Absolutely.
And they'll need your support.
Absolutely.
Is there any other advices or tips as we're nearing the end that you'd like to give to listeners about this topic?
I think I'd just like to reiterate, because I think our audience are largely Christians, and I'd just like to reiterate that mental illness doesn't mean the person or you're suffering from a lack of faith. It doesn't mean that God has somehow abandoned you. It doesn't mean that there is some kind of a curse, demonic curse on you. It just simply means that you're suffering from a condition like any other physical condition that you could have suffered from. And I wish I had more time in this show to go through some of the other things that we wanted to talk about, but maybe we could cover those in another show. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of today's broadcast. And Melissa, I want to thank you very much for being in studio with us today and for helping us discuss this issue.
You're welcome.
You have been listening to the Life Transformation Radio broadcast. I am your host, Michael Hart of Elim Counselling Services, and I want to thank you so much for listening to this edition of Life Transformation. Until next time, I pray that God would bless you in all your relationships and keep you sound in mind and pure in heart. God bless you, and thank you very much for listening.